All right, while Michael's not here, listeners, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to include his Whistling the Gamera theme in the episode somewhere, but don't tell him. I want to see if he notices. Shh.
Okay.
What? I didn't say nothing. I didn't have a secret conversation with the listeners that you wouldn't know about. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Kaiju Weekly, the weekly podcast that introduces you to the wide world of giant monster movies. I am your host, Travis, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Elvis Humberdinck.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You know how hard it is to come up with a weird name for you each week?
You know, I don't even know.
That's a lot of pressure. That's a lot of pressure.
I don't even know why you even started doing that.
I am just putting so much pressure on myself each week. I'm like, man, I gotta think of a crazy name.
Talk about you, because now I have to come up with a voice to match whatever ridiculous name you give me. Yeah, last week I culturally appropriated the British accent. This week I'm doing the same thing for Elvis. I mean, well, come on.
Yeah, got Elvis. You got Elvis now. Oh man, got a hunka burning kaiju.
Hunka burning love. Okay, anyway, that's enough of that. I'm sorry.
It's a hunka burning kaiju. Stay on brand.
Wait, no, this is a shipping-free podcast, Travis.
Oh man, we're already off the rails and we're just getting started. So, well, everyone, we have got a great episode this week, and we're going to start off by covering just a simple news story. So let's cue the beady beady.
Cue the beady beady.
All right, so we're going to start off talking about the news by mentioning that we have reached 1,000 downloads for the podcast.
Ooh.
Probably about 3 months ago.
Yeah. Like I think we just got done recording a Patreon episode, and we mentioned that we switched hosting services. Like, was it like 3 months ago, 2 months ago, something like
somewhere around there, like May, I think. Yeah.
So from May to now, at the time of this recording, what is this? Is this August the 2nd? Right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
We are at 1,029 downloads. So, Travis, thank you for being such a wonderful host for all these downloads.
And thank you so much, Michael, for sticking with all of my ridiculousness for all this time.
I have to take a Xanax every time we record, but it's worth it.
Yeah. I mean, and to be honest, like, I've probably mentioned it before. I've mentioned it, on Twitter and stuff, but you were never meant to be the main co-host of this. You were supposed to be a guest host, and then you were supposed to go about the rest of your life not worrying about.
I was supposed to come on for 5 episodes and then ride off into the sunset.
Yes, exactly.
As the hero I am, as I was supposed to be like, Godzilla at the end of Terror of Mechagodzilla, and just ride off into the sunset to never be seen or heard from again. But just as the great Al Pacino put it, I thought I was out, and then they sucked me back in.
Yep. And so, like the Simpsons franchise that just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going, and nobody wants to hear or see them anymore, Michael has stuck around. No, I do really appreciate that you have been with us with this podcast with me co-hosting, because when Steven had to step down for personal reasons, you really stepped up and have just been just irreplaceable on this podcast, because there's no way that that Kaiju Weekly would still be going, and especially not going the way it is without your help. So thank you so much.
Are you sure that irreplaceable is not a euphemism for something?
You're irreplaceable. To the left, to the left. Michael sits to the left.
Oh God. Okay. All right. Well, I will say this. It has been a lot of fun. I went back and I listened to some of my earlier episodes. I listened to Frankenstein Conquers the World, episode 9. Check it out; it's a great episode. And then I listened to a few others that we did together. And man, I'll be honest with you; those early episodes when it was just me and you trying to figure some stuff out, they were rough. I will say that, but yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and I just kind of appreciate the opportunity. And you could say that I caught the podcasting bug because of you. So yeah.
Well, I'm glad that you did, and I'm glad that you're here. And I'm glad that all of the listeners are here and downloading. And please keep sharing it with all your friends. We're trying to adjust things as we go to make the podcast more accessible to people. But at the same time, we want to have fun, and we want to do what we want to do that's going to appeal to us.
Yeah, I think we're one of the only. What is it? We're the only, or one of the only, actually weekly podcasts about giant monsters. Am I right?
Yeah, one of the only ones. I can't think of too many other ones. I mean, you can count Eric and Alex Monsters versus Men, but they record so much in advance that they're not recording weekly. They're recording a bunch and releasing them weekly. But yeah, we try to record. There's been a few times we've had to record ahead, but we try to record every week and stay on schedule.
We're at least the one. We're at least the only one, or one of the only ones. I don't want to say the only one because there's always a
podcast out there that's doing.
Yeah, there's always another podcast out there. Man, that just reminds me of some weird stuff I saw on iTunes once. But anyway, we're one of the only ones that actually does the news weekly and records it usually in real time. Now, we did do a few episodes recently where we recorded like 3-4 weeks in advance, but we're typically an actually weekly podcast. We record this show either on Saturday or Sunday, or just whenever we can find time to do it. And yeah, I mean, we do it for the listener. We do it for the love of this genre and this fandom. So yeah, I mean, I don't regret a day of it.
Yeah, it's still one of my favorite things to do each week is to sit down and record an episode of Kaiju Weekly.
Yeah. So, I know we actually have an actual news item to get to, Travis, other than just patting ourselves on the back. So do you want to cue the beady beady?
Yeah, well, we already cued the beady beady.
Well, cue the beady. Okay, never mind.
Ooh, yeah, we already cued the beady beady, but we'll cue the beady beady again. Maybe we'll do the Gauss Gauss.
Gauss Gauss.
But yeah, so the only news story that we're going to cover on the main episode is the release of the English subtitles for Nezura 1964 teaser trailer. Now, this is the same teaser trailer that's been out for a little while for this Nezura 1964 movie that's coming soon. But they didn't have English subtitles for it. They finally released the English subtitles for it. So now you can go and watch it on YouTube. I have a link for it to check out this teaser trailer.
All right. Okay. Yeah, we'll post a link to that in the show notes. But if it's the same trailer that I'm thinking of that I remember, it's just I think it's a black and white sort of primer for the movie itself. We don't actually get to see the kaiju, and from what I understand, there's actually going to be an actual man in suit kaiju for this film. Am I right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. There's a suit that has been made for it.
I've seen the maquette, but but a lot of the posts I've seen about the film have all been in Japanese, and since I don't read Japanese very well, except when I run it through Google Translate, and a lot of times that's not super accurate. But that's a lot of words. Anyway, I just assumed that I actually assumed when the news of this film first came out, I just assumed it was going to be a documentary. There we go. Just like you.
Mm-hmm.
Thought the same thing. It was going to be like the making of Nezura 1964, the lost film about a giant rat, or however they wanted to title it. but it's
Right.
going to be an actual kaiju film, which excites me because I'm always up for some new and exciting kaiju or
Yeah.
daikaiju. There we go, Henry. Sorry, daikaiju.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what comes of this. I know that the guys over at Tokyo Lives, they've talked about, because it is the same people who did The Great Buddha Arrival, and The Great Buddha Arrival is another one of those films that it was a lost film. That some footage. I think there's only some still images that still exist. Somebody corrected me on it one time when on our previous episode about what counts as a lost film and what doesn't. And so they're doing something. From what I can tell, they're just from the teaser trailer, and this may be wrong, but it looks like they're doing the same thing that they did with The Great Buddha Arrival, where the original film events supposedly happened in the real world and no one knew about it because it was covered up, and now it's happening again. Is what happened with The Great Buddha Arrival.
Okay.
And it looks like they're kind of doing something similar in Nezura. Maybe
Okay.
not.
Right. Yeah, that sounds super interesting. That does.
Yeah, it does sound interesting. I know Rob has talked about how when he was talking about The Great Buddha Arrival specifically, he said that he wished they would have just did like a movie about the Great Buddha Arrival and not had, hey, this thing that happened in the past, actually happened, and here it is again and stuff. Like, tried to basically use what little bit was left of that movie as almost like a found footage type thing.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure. I haven't seen it yet. I do want to cover it on the podcast at some point. So we'll
No,
talk
we'll
about.
definitely cover it because I've already if it had come out during our upcoming Creepy Crawlers month, I would have loved to have covered it then if we could have gotten our hands on a copy.
Oh, of Nezura, yeah, Nezura would be good for a creepy crawly one because it's just rats.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it coming out. I'm looking forward to watching it, and I know we will cover it at some time on the pod. We might cover it shortly after it actually gets released. We don't know. We'll just have to find a way to maybe fit it into the schedule.
Yeah, and it just depends on availability and whether we're going to even be able to see it when it first comes out, or whatever.
Oh,
So
the way things are going though, Travis, we've been getting our hands on some pretty rare, or at least a good amount. I wouldn't say rare. Probably rare is not the right word to use. We've been getting our hands on a pretty good amount of kaiju and daikaiju and giant monster stuff lately. So it wouldn't shock me that it wouldn't pop up on, say, Yahoo Japan, or Yahoo or Amazon.co.jp, which is their
mm-hmm.
which is Japan Amazon. There we go. Words
Yeah.
tripping me up today. You can, and I've ordered stuff from there before, so you can get your hands on it. Now, as far as like streaming services and stuff like that, I have no idea.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So we'll just have to wait and see, and we'll keep all the listeners informed as it unfolds.
Yeah, definitely.
But that is it for the news for this week. If you want to hear more news because you are interested in what's going on in the world of kaiju, of giant monster movies, if you want to hear us talk about the new line of Pulgasari figures coming from Mondo and our opinions on that, or what new kaiju film is Arrow releasing, we've got the people already getting their hands on the Gamera box set. Have you seen that on Twitter? It's crazy. And so what new or what other kaiju film is Arrow releasing in an HD format? We talk about it over on Patreon. So you can check out our Patreon, patreon.com/Kaiju Weekly Pod. And we will be posting a audio of just like 20 minutes, 30 minutes of us talking about the news for the week.
Yeah, and it's I will say this: our Patreon episodes are a little bit more relaxed. They're not nearly as structured as, say, actually a formal episode. Travis and I just like to have a casual conversation about the news of the week, and so I think that's one of the benefits that people can get out of becoming a Patreon if they kind of just want to listen to us discuss with one another the news for the week in a more casual format. Yeah, I want to invite everybody to do that.
Yeah, and on a slow news week, we may even talk about other things. Like our opinions on some of the tokusatsu shows, like Ultraman Z or Ultraman Z, or
Yeah,
one of
it'll
those.
be a good place to sort of put all the things that we can't necessarily get to during the podcast, but we still want to share and talk about. So the Patreon is a great place for that.
Yep. And whenever I edit the Patreon episodes, I always bump up the playback speed to 1.5 so that I can get through it quicker when I'm editing, because I'm so short on time. And it is hilarious hearing us talk like chipmunks.
All right, there you go, listener. A little bit of behind the scenes on how the
I
show
kind
really gets
I kind of want to suggest that people who listen to us at 1.5 speed, because it is hilarious each week when I'm
No.
editing.
I suggest people listen to us at half speed,
Oh
or
man.
I suggest people to listen to us at half speed, just because I do that sometimes with podcasts, and it's hilarious because then the host sounds really drunk or
Oh
sleepy.
yeah. Yeah, they totally do. And I already sound half asleep half the time that I'm on here anyway. So all right. So let's get into our main topic. Let's stop
All right,
worrying
let's
about
go
this.
for it.
So we ask a trivia question each week to get us onto the topic, and we put it out there onto our social medias and have people answer, and when we give them shout outs. So the trivia question that was for this week's episode was, what American monster movie had a festival dedicated to it that, until this year, because of COVID, took place annually at Phoenixville, Pennsylvania?
Okay, what did the listeners tell us, Travis?
Well, our first shout out that we're going to give is to Nathan, who always gives us a funny answer, and he gave us the monster that ate Pennsylvania.
You redeemed yourself from last week, Nathan, or no, the week before.
The week before, Orochi. Orochi, he just sent Orochi, and it's like, yeah. I say you always give us a funny answer, and then you don't give us a funny answer.
The setup was perfect. But anyway, moving on.
Yeah, it was good. Jimmy from NASA also sent us a funny answer. He said it came from Pennsylvania, so that was a good one. The guys over at Giant Monster BS sent us Monsters Inc. Not quite right, but thank you for competing or not competing, but taking part.
I like Monsters Inc. It's a good movie.
Yeah, it's a good movie. I have a feeling, and I need to go back and double check because I don't pay enough attention to the Giant Monster BS guys have been sending us Monsters Inc. for every question. And I just haven't noticed it because I feel like I've read a thing from them saying Monsters Inc. before. So
you may have. It's really tough to keep track of those guys. It's really actually tough to keep track of. It's really tough to keep track of the Twitters in general, but it's especially tough to keep track of Grattan and Matt. So
yeah, if you guys are actually, and I'm assuming you guys are listening. I don't know if you are listening. If that is what you guys are doing, bravo, because you have slipped it by me and I did not notice until now. Then we had Gamera himself on Twitter said the Blob. And we also had the Aqua Slug, David H. Tidy, or I want to say Tidy because I definitely don't want to say Titty.
I want I believe it's Tidy.
Tidy. Okay. And then Mark Myers also said the Blob. So they all got the answer correct. In fact, Mark Myers said that they still do the movie theater panic scene each year at the festival that we're going to talk about later on in the movie. And I will bring up that in our fun facts. And then just to finish off on a happy note, Danny DeMana from the Godzilla Novelization Project sent in a movie about a certain gelatinous giant that creeps, leaps, glides, and slides across the floor. To which both of us simultaneously replied, so Flubber?
Yeah, that was hilarious because I sent that. I saw Danny's reply, and I immediately typed back Flubber ? And then I think you DM'd me and you're like, oh my god, I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, I was just fixing to type that exact same thing when you sent it because we both have access to the Kaiju Weekly Twitter, and so I was like, I was just fixing to do that. Yeah, so that was funny. So yeah, we're covering Flubber this week. Not the original, but the Robin Williams remake.
The better version.
Would that count as kaiju? Henry, message us, oh great Henry, and tell us from it came from a monster movie, and tell us is Flubber kaiju?
I don't know. I could probably ask him, honestly, but
oh man, no, that's fine. I just it's funny. But no, yeah. So this week we are reviewing The Blob from 1958, directed by Irvin Yeaworth, starring Steve McQueen. Annetta Corsott is how I think is how you say her name. I'm not really sure. Earl Rowe, Olin Howland, and the plot breakdown is: a mysterious creature from another planet resembling a giant blob of jelly lands on Earth. The people of a nearby small town refuse to listen to some teenagers who have witnessed the blob's destructive power. In the meantime, the blob just keeps getting bigger and bigger. So, getting into our initial thoughts, Michael, what are your initial thoughts on The Blob?
Well, The Blob is considered one of the original classic monster movies. It's from 1958. It's after Gojira and some others, but I hadn't seen this film in a long time, and I got the opportunity to watch the Criterion version, which, by the way, is beautiful. It's a beautiful remaster of the film. The colors are just awesome, and from what I can tell, I think we talked about this was filmed in color, not black and white, because I remember this film growing up being in black and white.
Yeah, that's what we talked about, because there is a black and white version of this film. And so I was trying to remember whether this movie was filmed in black and white and then colorized, like many films from that era were, or whether this was actually filmed in color, because the colors looked way too crisp and way too good in the Criterion version to be to me to be colorized. And we looked it up, and yeah, it was filmed in color. So there is a black and white version, but it was originally filmed in color.
Yeah. Well, aesthetics aside, I like this film. I'd honestly forgot about this film. I knew it was out there in the ether as one of the classics of the horror sci-fi monster genre. And yeah, I'm so glad we actually covered this on the podcast, because it gave me the opportunity to revisit it. And I'm sitting there like a big kid, like I'm watching it for the first time almost, because I remember growing up and watching this on like the old TMC and AMC network. It would come on like late at night or later on in the evening, like during their like Saturday matinee or something like that. And yeah, it was a good nostalgia trip for me. We'll get into some of the details later on in the episode, but overall, I'm gonna say that I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah, this movie is one of my favorite, if not my absolute favorite, monster movie that's not one of the Japanese tokusatsu monster movies.
Okay.
This is up there as one of my all-time favorites. I love The Blob. I remember watching it as a kid, and I remember being afraid as a kid watching this movie, because it scared me as a kid. But I still liked it. And yeah, it had been a few years since I've seen it, and then getting to watch the Criterion version of it, it was so gorgeous and so beautiful. And like you said, it took me back to being a kid and watching this movie, and I had so much fun watching it. So yeah, absolutely, it is one of my favorites. And I do have some complaints about it, which we'll get into, but overall, it is such a fun, beautiful film.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about some stuff that we didn't particularly care for, but overall, I can probably, if the listener hasn't already found out or realized, we both really like this movie. You know, it follows the same formula of like a 1950s teenage hot rod type movie, because those are super popular at the time. You know, it's what you would expect from your typical 1950s giant monster film. It's definitely a popcorn movie. It's definitely something that I can see, you know, if I was someone back in the 50s, like this is coming out in theaters, I would take my date to the drive-in, and it was definitely something meant as a date movie for young adults, young people.
Yeah. Well, there is something very interesting about this movie. Now, when we're talking about American monster movies, and I mean, in in the 50s and stuff, there are movies that predate this. Absolutely. There are movies that predate this. This is not one of the first. There was a lot of them beforehand. However, this movie was very unique in a few ways that we'll talk about when we get into a little bit more details, because I have a few fun facts there. But there are some things that make this movie really unique. But one thing that helped this movie along was that in the late 50s, from 1955 onward, the drive-in movie theaters boomed. That was the height of them. That was the drive-in movie theater has never been more popular than between 1955 and 1962. I looked it up. And that was when this movie came out. This movie came out in 1958, so it came out right at the height of these drive-in movie theaters. And before that, movies were going into theaters. You even see in this movie, they would have the spook shows, where were these scary horror genre films that they would put late at night, or not late at night, but just like in the evening time for people to go and watch and stuff. But then the drive-in movie theater introduced a whole new generation of monster films and genre films and horror films to people, because now the drive-in movie theater was a whole new experience, and movies were being made for that. And so I think that The Blob is historically and culturally significant because of its impact on filmmaking and the culture of people, because this became such a big hit in the drive-in theaters specifically.
Yeah, there's something really nostalgic for me about the drive-in theater experience, because I remember going to because in the little town that I grew up in, we actually had our very own drive-in theater. It was still functional. It was something they did. They put on like a double feature every weekend for whoever wanted to come. Of course, admission was, you had to pay admission, but popcorn was free. It was served by one of the local churches in the area. And it was just a really fun experience. In fact, I remember my first drive-in movie was with my mom, and we watched I think we watched the Flintstones, of all things. I remember going to watch the original Flintstones movie with the guy from Kong Skull Island and Roseanne. What is his name?
John Goodman.
John Goodman. There we go. But yeah. I remember going and seeing this movie with my mom, and we watched the Flintstones, the original starring John Goodman, and it was just a fun experience. And I remember that, and I have sort of a fond, and I remember watching sort of films and bringing it back to the Blob here. I remember they would put on some of these old 50s and 60s horror films or giant monster films at that little drive-in theater we had in that town. And I just remember being able to partake in that experience, and I cannot necessarily imagine what it was like to experience it for the first time, because I just can't wrap my head around it, because we have streaming and stuff like that now, and I have a real fondness, honestly, for some of the more some of the nostalgia stuff, the vintage ways of watching movies and stuff. I really wish I could have my own film reel to watch old movies on. I know it sounds really silly. And I have my own record player. I play records. I prefer records over CDs. It's just me.
Yeah.
Bringing it back to the Blob, this was definitely felt like a date movie to me. It was definitely appealing to young adults, preteens at the time, and you can tell by the cast, and you can tell by how young, quote unquote young, they are supposed to be.
Yeah, well, I was gonna save this for later on, but since you've brought it up a couple of times now. There's an article that I read after I watched the movie, just to kind of do a little research. And I'll put a link in the show notes for this article, because it's a fantastic article. And it's called "The Blob: A Film Ahead of Its Time," and it's by Sam Lenz or Lenz. And he talks about what made this movie so significant and why it was ahead of its time. It was, he says, and this is a quote from that article: "The Blob was completely different from the other genre films being produced at that time. Movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956 and The Mummy from 1959 and the Universal monster flicks of the 1930s. They all centered around adults, scientists, doctors, etc. These protagonists were stuffy grown men and women and didn't reflect the teens that were going to the movies.
Mm-hmm.
Teenagers weren't given any attention in the genre flicks they love so much, and if they did, they were portrayed as nothing but a nuisance. The Blob changed that by making a movie about teenagers." So yeah, I think that is very fascinating that this movie was really the first genre film to say, hey, teenagers are going to the movies. Teenagers are the ones enjoying these movies. Why not focus on them and make them the protagonist of the movie? And think of how much that influenced genre films later on. I mean, just think of all the 80s horror movies that we had. You know, you had Nightmare on Elm Street and the Jason Voorhees, you know, Friday the 13th movies and stuff. And those are all centered around teenagers taking it upon themselves to take out the bad guy, the monster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that goes back to this movie. This movie originated that. And I think that's really significant. We need to get into some of our likes and dislikes.
Sure.
So I know we've kind of, you know, we have talked about some of the positive things. So what are some other things that you liked about this movie besides, you know, what we've already talked about?
Aside from all the nostalgia stuff, is what you mean?
Yeah.
You know, the Blob itself, I went into this movie not with, I'll admit, I went into it with low expectations, but it really surprised me. It really surprised me on how effective sort of the miniature scaling and stuff like that was, because you really can't even tell that this is, you know, filmed on a small miniature set. The effects when the scene when the Blob first appears and it takes over that man's hand and you see that really quick action, you know what I'm talking about? Like it just latches on to that farmer's hand and then eventually begins to grow. That was a really neat effect to me, and I'm curious I tried to see how they did it, and I can only assume that maybe. Yeah,
it was reversed. Yeah, they took it, spread it out over his hand, and then let it slide off his hand, and then reversed that shot, you know, in the camera. So yeah,
which is probably, you know, it's not uncommon now because we've seen it throughout other kaiju films, other giant monster films. But at that time, it was probably a fairly innovative way to capture that effect.
I don't know if it was necessarily innovative because it was something that existed. It existed, and monster movies were not the only movies that used that. Like they would use that even in regular, you know, drama films for certain things. They might reverse shots. Driving in cars, they may have to film in reverse. So I don't know how innovative it was, but I do think it was utilized really well.
Well, that may have been that's a much better way to put it, Travis. Thanks.
Yeah. Now, I'm with you. The monster effects in this are so great. They really create just like real moments of suspense and terror. And a big part of that is how simple the monster is. It's not elaborate. There's no big costume, big suit that has to be moved around using wires or anything like that. There's no stop motion that you have to sit there and spend hours upon hours upon hours to, you know, moving it just little by little to film and then do. It's none of that. It's just a big blob that they just move around on set and in the camera. And because of the simplicity of it, I think the special effects for the blob itself hold up even today. Like this is 70 years later and the blob still looks just as good as it, you know, now as it did back then.
Yeah, it's not in fact, I really find this movie an effective horror movie.
Mhm.
because, like you said, it's just a gelatinous blob. There's no arms, no legs, no facial expressions, nothing. It is just a mindless, well, a seemingly mindless, um, just blob of matter, just eating whatever comes in its path. And it's such a simple idea, but it's at the same time such a simple idea. It's almost terrifying because it's sort of that fear of the unknown. You don't know what this thing is thinking. You don't know what its
Mhm.
motives are. All you know is it's just this giant gelatinous
Yeah,
bubble
there's
that
no
likes to eat stuff.
emotions to read in it. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do really, speaking of the effects and the simplicity of the effects, there is a fun thing that they did with the blob is when it first appears and latches onto that old man's hand, which again, like I'm with you, is probably my favorite part of the whole movie. It's so terrifying because he just picks up this glob of goo, and then it suddenly just wraps around his hand, and he can't get it off, and you don't know what's happening. It's so great. But
Hmm.
when it first shows up, it's actually blue. It actually has like a bluish color to it, almost translucent
Yeah, I can
blue.
see that. Yeah.
And then they actually, and this is actually what they did because I read it in the fun facts. I have it listed in the fun facts, but they actually added red dye to it each time that it ate someone. They added another bit of red dye to it so that it kept getting more and more red as the movie kept going, the more people it ate. So it was
Huh.
almost like for a 1950s movie, that's pretty gory because I mean, like you're talking about like this thing is now getting full of blood and
Hmm.
stuff of from its victims, and yeah, it's a 1950s movie, so it's not explicit in any kind of way, but from a 50s standpoint, that's pretty gory to just kind of even hint to the fact that it's turning blood red from the number of people it's eating.
Yeah, it's not just it's not only gory, but it's actually brilliant to think about it in that way. You know, kudos to the production team for whomever come up with that idea or concept. Kudos to them because that is actually quite brilliant. They could have very easily just left it the same color, but changed how big it was. And they could have
Hmm.
easily just left it at that. But they didn't. They actually thought it through. And that's what makes it's those little details like that that make this movie so good.
Yeah, exactly. That is a good way of looking at it. I think there's a lot of little details in this movie that, and I have seen some negative reviews of this movie.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, I mean it's fine.
yeah,
You're going to get negative reviews on everything.
right. And I think that the ones that I've read, a lot of people don't pick up on those little details because those little details do make a huge difference in the movie. I do want to ask you a question though. Now, talking about this movie, and we already mentioned how nostalgic it is, and how everything because it's from an era and of a time. It's very much a time capsule from that period. But do you think this movie is dated at all?
Yes, but not because of the monster.
Yeah.
Not because of the monster. It dates itself. Trying to think of how to word this. It dates itself in sort of the way humans interact. Okay, so I'm just gonna go for it. There's a
Hmm.
scene in the is a scene in the movie where this older couple is woken up
Hmm.
in the film and they're sleeping in separate beds. To me, that feels like an outdated thing because that's what people used to do back in the day. My parents even did that for many years.
Mm. To me, the movie seems dated, but in the way that like, and I'm not comparing the quality of the film, but just in the way that it's dated to something like Citizen Kane. Like Citizen Kane, if you watch it, it's dated. It's
Hmm.
absolutely a dated film, but it's
Yeah.
still
Okay.
on the list. People like it is still either the greatest film ever made or the second greatest film ever made, and because it goes back and forth in the top two with Vertigo. By Alfred Hitchcock. And so to me, this movie does feel dated, but it feels dated in the way that those old classic movies are. It's like, yes, some of the things in here are definitely not stuff that holds up by a modern standard, but you kind of just take it because you recognize that this film wasn't made with a modern sensibility in mind. It was made with their sense, that 1958 sensibility.
Mhm.
So you kind of have to take it with the context, within the context that it was filmed in.
Yeah.
And if you take it within that context, it's not dated. It actually, it is absolutely a fun and something that modern people can enjoy if you remember the context that it's in. But if you try to apply modern sensibilities to it, well, it's not going to hold up because, of course, it's a 1958 film.
Yeah, and I like to view these movies sort of as a sort of like a time capsule, sort of like a
Mm-hmm.
like a snapshot into a bygone time in history. Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, classic movies like
Right.
that. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Some of the more class, and obviously the Blob, and King Kong, and some others, if we're
Mm-hmm.
going to talk about giant monsters. But I like to view sort of these classic movies as sort of just sort of a snapshot into past history. I know going into them that they're not necessarily going to appeal to a broader to a modern audience in terms of sort of the way they address the sensibilities, like you said, the sensibilities and the way they address certain issues. But that doesn't mean that some of the themes, like teamwork and not overlooking certain sections of the population just because you
Mm-hmm.
think they don't know anything, not taking people seriously because of their age or background, whatever. And those themes still hold up, and there's themes like that throughout some of these classic films, and there's themes in this movie. But that's the way I try to view these classic films like The Blob and others, just sort of just snapshots into history, into film history. And there's a lot we can learn from this film, from the technical aspect, and there's a lot we can learn from sort of the social aspect as well, I think.
Yeah. One thing I think that holds up nowadays is the acting. I think the acting in this movie was fantastic, especially from Steve McQueen, because Steve McQueen this was his first starring role. This was his first film that he had actually, been starring in. And he did a fantastic job. Now, of course, his age, yeah, he's a 28-year-old man playing a teenager. But there's a moment towards the end where he is actually trying to talk to the entire town and tell them about this monster that is threatening their town, and no one wants to believe him. And when the police, come, and he's talking to the police officers, and he says, "Look at me. Am I laughing? Do I look like I'm playing a practical joke, or do I look like I'm scared stiff?" And that moment of intensity that he has in it was
Mm.
so great. And there's a moment where he starts doubting himself earlier on in the movie, where he's like, maybe I didn't see what I saw. Maybe I am making it up. Maybe I am, not. And the female character played, her name was Jane. Yeah, Jane.
Yes, Jay.
She has to pull him up by his bootstraps because he needs that kind of like lifting. The thing that I think really dates this film, there are other things that do it too, but the thing that to me dates the film the most is the portrayal of Jane, because
Yeah, yeah.
there's an entire moment in this movie, or like towards the beginning, when the hot rodding kind of moment where he gets challenged to a race on the road and stuff. And there's a good solid like 15 to 20 minutes of that movie where Jane just does not say anything. She's sitting there, she's in the scene, but she doesn't say a single word. And again, if you take it into the context of when this movie came out, that's not that unusual, but I still think it's worth mentioning just because it is something that happens.
Yeah,
Um,
it's worth mentioning. And this is 2020. This film came out, what, 58? This is
yeah,
2020.
58. Mm-hmm.
Obviously things have changed since then. You have to sort of view this film in the context of the time that it was brought out to the public, where at that time this was typical. I mean, it's by today's standards it wouldn't fly, obviously, but
Right. Yeah.
in 58. I mean,
Yeah, that was the
people
norm.
it was the norm. People wouldn't bat an eyelash at all.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's worth mentioning, but it is something. Something and going along with that though, I mentioned that article by Sam Leans or Lenz,
Mhm.
and he does talk about the way Jane is portrayed, and he says while she's not by a modern standpoint, she's not necessarily great. Of course, it was the 1950s, but she said by a 1950s standpoint, she had a little bit more agency than other female leads in these
Mhm.
genre movies.
Right.
Like we mentioned, when Steve begins to doubt himself, Jane is the one who pulls him up by his bootstraps. He also mentions how she's the one who makes the decision to sneak out and stop the monster.
Yeah,
Um,
she does.
and he mentions how she basically exists as a romantic partner to Steve. There's still glimpses of a more developed character throughout the film. There are moments, and we can talk about too. There's a scene where they're in the diner, and the characters have to basically resign themselves of we're probably going to die because there's no getting out of here now. And she has this really emotional moment where she has tears in her eyes, but she's not like crying like that acting crying.
Mhm.
She has just the hint of tears in her eyes as she's talking to Steve, and it is such an emotional, gut wrenching moment because it's like they basically have to say, okay, we're just going to sit here and die because there's nothing else to do until they figure something out and they do escape. But it's just such a she was.
That's a. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah, go ahead.
that's actually, I noticed that too, and it's actually a really interesting moment where you kind of see that a lot with modern films. You see the moment where our protagonists finally realize that we're not going to make it out of here alive. So we have to make the best of this decision that we have to make the best of this moment we're in the best way we possibly can to hopefully save others. Now that is a really ahead of its time concept for a film like this, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, and it goes back to the idea, like we mentioned earlier, how typically in these genre movies, especially from the 50s, they would be scientists or they would be police officers or they would be army men. So they would be the take action kind of people who would figure things out. It's like we're the kind that they're the kind that's going to figure it out, and us as an audience are not necessarily worried. At least, from my experience, I'm not necessarily worried about them because they're going to figure out how to escape. But these characters are just teenagers. They're 17 years old and they're trapped in a diner that's now covered by a monster that they know has and will eat anything in its path.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
they're just like, and not only is it the monster, because the blob covers this thing, they now have limited oxygen because they're in a confined space with no ventilation because
Yeah.
it's being blocked by the blob. So it's like we're either going to suffocate or be dissolved and eaten. And there's nothing we can do because we're stuck here and we're just 17-year-olds who are stuck in this situation. And it is such a powerful moment in that movie. Now, of
Yeah.
course, they do get out. Of course, they do figure out the way. In fact, they are the ones who figure out what the weakness of the blob is. So that, of course, it goes back to the trope of the hero always finds a way to escape. But
I just thought it was interesting at the end of the film, though. You saw all of the townspeople, specifically, like the young people that were in that theater, in that famous theater scene that you see a lot when this movie gets referenced. It was all like young people fighting back against this blob. There wasn't there was a few adults. I saw a few of the adults, I believe, but it was mainly just all the young people that was in that theater fighting back against this thing, which was, I feel like if I was a teenager watching this movie at that time, I would probably feel super empowered because by that.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that, and we can mention how the trope of adults not believing the kids is kind of it's a worn out trope because nowadays we're like, if a teenager comes up to you and says, "Hey, there's something happening and you need to take this seriously," we are more likely to kind of believe them. At least, most people I know are more likely to believe them.
Right.
But, But tropes have to start somewhere, and this is kind of an early example of that. Of teenagers are in the right and they know what's going on, and then the adults are like, nah, you're just. And like you said, you can watch this film as an adult and still feel like, hey, the teenagers aren't just teenagers. They represent the marginalized, voiceless group. They're the group that we have something important to say, and the people who are in power are not listening to what we're saying.
Right. And it's super interesting because at that time it was the teenagers, it was the young people that was being marginalized and not listened to. I'm not going to get into politics, but you see those same ideals being expressed in films in the modern day too. So, but just in a different way.
Yeah. Another thing in this movie that I want to ask one more question after I say this. Sure. Then I want to ask one more question. But one more thing that does kind of take this movie from the 1950s and bring it to the modern day is one of the final line, the last line in the movie, when they're talking about as long as the creature stays frozen, they're safe, and so they're going to take it to the Arctic, to where it'll stay cold. And Steve McQueen's character says, "Yeah, as long as the Arctic stays cold." Now, in the 1950s, I don't know how much global warming was on anybody's mind.
I don't know. I noticed that too. And at the end of a film like this, at the end of any film, there tends to be that one line, maybe that's supposed to be an indirect message. Right. So I'm like, I don't know if it was meant to mean something.
Yeah, I don't know if it was meant to be like a, well, as long as it stays cold, kind of a tongue-in-cheek, thing of like, well, of course the Arctic's going to stay cold. But watching it nowadays and knowing that global warming is a thing and global warming, is affecting the polar ice caps, that is a line that resonates in a whole different way than what I think they expected it to in 1958.
Yeah, I think honestly, I want to just take a shot in the dark and say that it was probably meant to be just a throwaway line at that point in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One more question I want to ask, and then we can move on to some fun facts, because I have a lot of fun facts I want to get through. So, what is your favorite scene in this movie? We talked about quite a few of the scenes, but what is your favorite scene from this movie?
Oh man, what was my favorite scene? Oh god, that's tough. Okay, so I'm gonna have to go with probably the scene in the doctor's office, where they've left the gentleman, they've left the farmer in the doctor's office. They've went to go get help. They went to the police station to bring back help. And they come back, and at this point, we've already seen the Blob attack the doctor. We've seen the Blob attack his nurse. And they all come back to find this eerie sort of quiet scene. The power's been knocked out in the house. And then you get a slow reveal of the Blob coming from behind the doorway. And then you see it. It's gotten bigger. It's gotten human size. And I thought, for me, that was a really nice reveal for the Blob itself too.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's great. I've mentioned that I think my favorite scene, it's a simple scene, but I think my favorite scene is when the Blob latches onto that farmer's hand, because up until that moment, if you're watching this for the first time and you're not 100% sure how the creature behaves, that immediately is just such a scary moment. And anybody who's ever gotten their hand stuck in a cookie or pickle jar will know that fear of having something stuck to your hand and not being able to get it off.
You just said that, and it reminded me of the other morning. I was trying to make coffee, and I was trying to get that last little scoop in the bottom of the jar. And dummy me, instead of just picking up the jar, turning it over, and dumping the rest of the grounds into the coffee maker, I decided I was going to try to scoop it out myself by using, my scooper, but I got my hand caught in the jar. Literally got my hand caught in the coffee jar rather.
Oh my goodness.
And I had to run it under hot soapy water to get it out.
Oh
So
my goodness. That sounds like something I would do.
I know, it was stupid. It was a duh moment. Why didn't I just pick it up, turn it over like a normal human being? But it was also 5 a.m. and I hadn't gotten much sleep, so
Right. You were
that's
making
what I had.
coffee, so it was like I need coffee to think, and here I am. Oh man, that's funny. That's funny. Yeah, it just made me think of Saturday Night Live when they do their Celebrity Jeopardy. And they had Tom Hanks on there, and Tom Hanks had his hand stuck in a pickle jar, and they're like, Tom, just let go of the pickle. He's like, but I want the pickle. Just let go of the pickle so you can get the. But I want the pickle.
Is the pickle worth it?
He's like, you don't understand. I want the pickle. I can't let go of the pickle. Oh man. So yeah. Anyway, are you ready to move into some fun facts?
Yeah, let's do it.
So going into one fun fact that ties in with your favorite scene from the movie, when the Doctor is being attacked by the Blob and is actually being eaten by the Blob that Steve sees through the window, there's actually more footage of that death, but that was cut out back in the day, and because it was considered too violent at the time period.
Well, yeah. That doesn't shock me.
Yeah, so the fact that they and I wish that scene survived, because I would be fascinated to see what they didn't include because they felt it was too violent.
Yeah, I'm sure maybe there's an uncut version out there somewhere of, like, maybe if you have the actual.
I doubt it. In 1958, I doubt there's an uncut version of this movie that exists that survived.
Maybe you never know. I mean, there's uncut versions of I want to say there's an uncut version of Gojira out there circling around somewhere.
Yeah, maybe. So I don't know. We did talk about how this movie was favorite for drive-in theaters. It was actually part of a double billing from Paramount, and it was actually the second film, meaning it was the one that was least popular, or the one that they didn't expect to be as popular. So the first movie that was on that double billing was I Married a Monster from Outer Space from the same year.
Okay.
And but early test marketing and initial bookings indicated that a larger share of the ticket buyers were coming for the Blob instead of that movie, which I had never even heard of that movie.
I don't think I've ever heard of that either.
So they were coming for the Blob rather than the top billed movie. So it became the main feature, and more money was spent on its promotion. So they weren't really promoting the Blob as much at the time because they were pushing this one that had the top billing, and this was just kind of tacked on with it. But then this one became more popular, so they're like, "Hey, let's switch them out."
That does not surprise me at all, because this is definitely, I would say, word of mouth got out about this movie, and probably teenagers at that time thought, well, do we want to watch this movie, or do we want to watch a movie where we're actually the heroes? So,
Right. Yeah, exactly. And speaking of that, that we could say that was a smart business decision, or a smart financial decision on the part of Paramount. Speaking of smart and not so smart financial decisions, one fact that I found was Steve McQueen was offered a choice. He could get $3,000 up front to play the role, or he could get a smaller upfront fee and 10% of the profits, which is not unusual. That's, a lot of people are offered that kind of thing. You either get this huge amount now, or big, let's say big, not huge, big amount now, or take a smaller amount now and risk the 10% of if the movie is profitable. And that's always a risk, because you never know if the movie is going to be profitable or not. Now, because Steve McQueen needed money up front for rent and for expenses like food and electricity and other things, he went ahead and took the upfront cost. So he was only paid $3,000 to be in this film, and didn't take any percentage of the profits.
Yeah, but what's $10,000 in 1958?
$3,000. $3,000.
I'm sorry, $3,000. Let's see, $3,000. $3,000 in 1958's adjustment for inflation, of course, would equal to $27,145 in 2020.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, it's not a small amount of money, but it also isn't as huge as what he could have taken. If he had taken a smaller upfront fee and took the 10% of the profits, he would have made a lot of money, because this movie ended up making, in 1958, it made $4 million profit.
God, that's $1 billion. That's $100 billion film, or not 100 billion. Jesus,
100 million.
$100 million film.
By today's standards. Yeah. So like he would have had huge. Now I have read that he was not a fan of this movie. He didn't think it was going to be any good. He didn't really even want to be remembered for this movie. And for a long time, he didn't talk about being in this movie and didn't want to talk about this movie. Towards later on in his life and career, he did eventually warm up to it. And actually, when he died, in the room that he died in, there was posters of movies that he had been in, and this was actually one of the ones that he had on his wall. So he eventually warmed up to it, but I know at first he, from what I read, he wasn't really a fan of it. And I don't think he really took it all that seriously, so that might have also influenced why he took the money up front. It's like, yeah, who's going to, like, I'm going to take 10% of nothing? Yeah, no. But it ended up being more than nothing.
This film has become over the decades a cult classic now. So
oh yeah, absolutely. There is a moment in the movie where a film is being shown in the theater. It's part of the spook show that the kids are going to see. The movie that's actually being shown is an actual movie. It was originally released as Dementia from 1955. The scenes shown are from the recut version titled Daughter of Horror, which had narration added to it. And the voice doing the narration is that of Ed McMahon.
Oh.
So Ed McMahon makes a weird roundabout cameo in this film.
There you go. If we ever do a redux of this movie, we can always use that as our trivia question.
Yeah. I liked the trivia question I came up with for though. What are you talking about my trivia question for?
I'm not. Okay. I'm gonna use the Homer Simpson meme and back away slowly.
Back off. I put a lot of thought into. No, I come up with them last minute. So another thing that's very unique about this film is having the title song. Now, I don't know if you fast forwarded through the opening credits or not, but the song at the beginning is something else.
Well, no, I didn't fast forward to it because I considered it part of the experience. So no, I didn't fast forward to it.
Yeah. And the reason why it was put in there was because they thought that the movie might be too scary just on its own. So they decided to add a little bit of lightheartedness at the beginning. By having this,
because it was not your typical dun dun dun.
Yeah. And surprisingly, which I talk a lot about this. So if you want to go back and listen to the Attack of the Killer Tomatoes episode, but when Attack of the Killer Tomatoes their movie is a satire of a lot of movies that were like this, like the Blob and stuff. And of course, Attack of the Killer Tomatoes has a very famous Attack of the Killer Tomatoes theme song in it too. And that comes back to the Blob. The Blob's theme song actually ended up becoming very, very popular. It topped out at number 33, I think, on the billboards back in the day, which was pretty good. You know, it did. I mean, for a theme song for a movie, did really well. That was its peak. The song is credited as being sung by the Five Blobs, which is actually a fake band because it was sung by Bernie Nee. And he just recorded his voice 5 times, and then they just, combined them together and played them together to make it sound like a harmony, a group. Okay. But the song was actually written by Mac David, and a young Burt Bacharach.
Huh. I know who Burt Bac. I know. I know who Burt Bacharach is.
Yeah, Burt Bacharach. He is a very well known singer and stuff nowadays, and he was an up and coming one. Now Mac David is the brother of the person who normally wrote songs with Burt Bacharach. So that's who that was. But yeah, so young Burt Bacharach wrote that song, and it became a nationwide hit. So
Okay. Well,
yeah, again, it goes back to the teen culture. This movie kind of appealed to teenagers in a lot of different ways.
And it also goes back to it's kind of a precursor to what we get with today's movies, where you've got that one title song for a film that winds up on the soundtrack. That if it's popular enough, it'll come on the radio. Which I think the most recent one that comes to mind first is the one with Lady Gaga and Brad Cooper.
Bradley Cooper, yeah.
From their A Star Is Born remake.
Yeah. I mean, that is a thing that even continues now to this day. You're right. And then, of course, I want to talk about, because we mentioned it at the beginning with the trivia question, is Blob Fest. Now, Blob Fest was a festival held in the town of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. It was started in the year 2000. And the reason why it's held at Phoenixville is because that is one of the filming locations for the movie, and it's held every year. It was canceled this year because of COVID, but it has been held every year since 2000. And activities include a reenactment of the scene in which moviegoers run screaming from the town's Colonial Theater, which was the theater from the movie. So you can actually be a part of that scene, because they'll play the Blob in that theater, and at a certain point, a certain day, you can run out, and everybody runs out of that theater screaming as a reenactment of that scene.
Sounds like
yeah, it sounds like a lot of fun. And the Colonial Theater was restored back to the way it looked back in 1958. So the theater actually looks the way it did back then, and it's the original theater from the movie.
Go ahead.
I was
gonna say that's actually really cool. I was Googling how far away Phoenix, Pennsylvania is from even where I live.
Well, while you're doing that, I'll go ahead and say that the Chef's Diner that you see them in, that scene that we talked about at length in our review, that is actually in a different town. That's from Downingtown, which has also been restored back to the way it looked back in 1958 and is open for business. So nice. You can actually go to that diner, and you can take pictures of the basements on weekdays. Weekday mornings, you can go and take pictures of the basement where they were at where they filmed that scene.
That's awesome. And Phoenixville, just because I was curious, Phoenixville's only like 6 hours from me.
Oh, that's not bad.
No, that's not terrible. Not terrible. Yeah. Maybe an on location Kaiju Weekly.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Listeners, support us on Patreon, because listen, I love the Blob. It is one of my favorite monster movies, and I would love to go to Blobfest one year. And if you give us just $1 a week, no, but really, if you support us on Patreon, you can give us the opportunity to go visit some of these places and some of these festivals and cons that we wouldn't normally be able to, like G-Fest. I would love to go to G-Fest and go to Blobfest and all these things. And the way we can do that is through support from Patreon. So if you guys can do that, we would love to have that support to be able to do these things.
Yeah, and we would definitely, it wouldn't just be us taking a trip. It would be us working on behalf of you, the listener, to bring you interviews and whatever else we can find of interest there.
Yeah, absolutely. And also something else that's fun at this Blobfest that I really want to see. So the actual Blob itself, the prop, for lack of a better word, that they made, it's a mixture of red dye and silicone, and it has never dried out after all these years. So what do
I
we
was
say?
wondering what it was made of because I remember you mentioning to me in the DM that
Mm-hmm.
that it was still soft. It's still squishy. So I'm
Yeah,
just kind of wondering what it was made of. So I figured it had to be some kind of silicone mixture.
yeah, it has never dried out after all these years, and it's still kept in the original 5-gallon pail that it was delivered in when it was shipped to the production company in 1958.
That's
So
cool.
that's really interesting. But where it's on display is it's put on display over the years as part of the annual Blob Fest held over a 3-day period each summer in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania.
That's cool.
So yeah, you can go and see the original stuff. They also have displays of some of the miniatures that were used in shooting. Um, like I said, they do the famous reenactment of the panicked theater goers. It sounds like so much fun. I would love to go to it. It sounds like a lot of fun. But yeah, that's it for the fun facts that I have. I mean, there were a few other little small fun facts, but we're running kind of long, so I want to get to our Godzuki scores and our final thoughts. So now we're going to move into our Godzuki scores. For anyone who is not familiar with the podcast or this is your first time listening to it, we like to score the movies out of 5 Godzukis because we like to pay homage to the great Godzuki, Godzilla's bumbling nephew from the Hanna-Barbera cartoon of the 1970s, by using him as our yardstick to measure these movies.
Yeah, we sure do.
So, Michael, out of 5 Godzukis, how many Godzukis would you give the Blob?
I'm gonna go ahead and give this 4.5 stars, which puts it up there with.
Wait, stars? Where did stars come from?
Oh, I'm sorry, 4.5. Oh boy, okay, four and a
Stars?
half.
I don't know of any stars around here.
Oh, I'm sorry. There are no stars on Monster Island. You're right.
But there sure as heck is a Godzuki.
Oh boy. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and give this movie a 4.5 Godzukis, simply because of for how much influence this film has on the genre itself. It deserves to be right up there, and it's not a bad movie in itself. It's very, very rewatchable in my opinion. I feel like the acting is good. The blob effect is great, and even it holds up even to this day. I think some of the miniature work and some of the set design is fantastic by today's standards. And it kind of blows my mind a little bit because considering when this movie was first made, and as an influence as words. Okay, back up. And as much influence as it's had over the years on the horror giant monster genre, I have to give it 4.5 stars, which I believe puts it right up 4.5 Godzukis. Jeez, what am I doing today? 4.5 Godzukis. I must be trying to think about my letterbox score already.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
4.5 Godzukis, which puts it right up there with, I think War of the Gargantuas has 4.5 as of this moment for me. So yeah.
Well, you know what? I'm going to give it the same score I gave War of the Gargantuas too, which, if you're not familiar with the podcast, War of the Gargantuas was my first 5 out of 5 Godzukis. So I'm going to give this. I was going back and forth because I'm like, well, there are some things in here that I think that could have been done differently, or that I think don't hold up by today's standards. But then the more I watched it, I was like, you know what? No, I'm going with 5 out of 5. Even with the things that I think are dated by today's standards, like the way they treated the female character. Reading that article that I'm going to link to in the description made me really appreciate that, you know what? Even for its time, they actually were doing more with the female character than what other genre films were doing. So I'm like, I don't think there's anything I would change about this movie. I think the movie is excellent the way it is. Here's my final thoughts. I wrote them down so that I could keep it concise. A spectacular monster movie and a must-see for any monster fan. This movie should definitely be viewed from within the context of the time period it was filmed. However, I feel like this movie holds up in a way that very few 50s creature features do. You think about other creature features from the 50s, like It Came From Beneath the Sea. It does not hold up as well as this movie does.
No, I think right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The simplicity of the monster means the effects hold up after all these years. The few complaints that I have for the movie are minor and really go back to the fact that the movie was from the 50s and is a bit dated. The Blob is not only a historically and culturally significant film, it's darn enjoyable to watch even in the modern day.
For sure.
I personally would consider this movie for the monster movie Mount Rushmore. Like, if you were making a Mount Rushmore of monster movies, I think you have to put Gojira.
Oh, yeah.
Because Gojira created the kaiju genre. You have to put Beast from 20,000 Fathoms because that movie inspired Gojira. It is the granddaddy, of all of these monster movies. I think it's, definitely got to be on there. And of course, King Kong, because King Kong is in some ways the original giant monster movie, that we would not have any of these without the original 1933 King Kong. But I think that because of its impact on American monster movies and American cinema in general, The Blob should be up there with those three, the other three movies.
Yeah, that is not a far off assessment there, because I think all those characters would definitely, in some way, shape, or form, make the top five. Yeah, there we go. The top picks for if we were going to do any kind of Mount Rushmore monument to the kaiju genre. I mean, that's as good as list. That's a great as list as any, in my opinion.
Yeah. Now, I do think it's kind of weird if we were doing a Mount Rushmore of these monster movies. I don't know how well the Blob will translate into stone. You see Godzilla's head, you see the beast from, the Rhedosaurus from 20,000 Fathoms, you see King Kong, and then you just see, is that just a rock? Yeah. It's just a smooth rock. Oh, man. Yep, so that's our review of The Blob. We hope that it wasn't too much rambling and stuff there, but we both really enjoyed this film. So
we did. Yeah, it was fantastic, and I stand by what I said. It's absolutely rewatchable, and I'm sure I'll watch it again at some point.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I want to sit and watch it now, just talking about it. I'm like, I kind of want to watch it again. So let's get into our next segment. Do you know what the next segment of the podcast is?
Surprise me.
It's the mailbag segment.
Ooh. What's in the mail today?
So we've got a letter that was sitting in our inbox for a while that I overlooked, and it's completely my fault. I didn't see it at first, and then we kind of got the last couple episodes were running long, so we had to cut it out. But I'm going to take the time just to quickly read through this email that we got from a very special listener. Special in so many ways.
I think I know exactly this letter you speak of. This person is, I think you're right. Let's just say he's special.
This person is special.
He's special. He's special. And the letter comes directly from David Marshall of the Kaiju Apostle.
David. Oh, poor David. Oh, no. So I'll read it and then I'll let them, it comes from Jimmy from NASA, who, if anyone is not familiar, Jimmy is the
Intrepid.
Intrepid. Yeah, that's the Intrepid. Producer of Monster Island Film Vault podcast. I was going to say foul mouth because he's always beeped, but that's just the way he communicates. So he sent us an email telling us, talking about our Atragon episode. So I'll go ahead and read that.
Okay.
It says, "Hey fellas, when I heard, or rather deciphered, that you were covering Atragon in your next episode, I knew I had to share my crazy story about that big, beautiful ship. So back in back in the 1980s, during my early days at NASA, I had to research the Gotengo as part of the design phase of the Goten, which is, if anybody's not familiar, Jimmy worked on the Goten, which is the ship from the movie The War in Space. No.
Yes.
Yes, The War in Space.
The War in Space.
I always get War in Space confused with the Battle from Outer Space.
No, it's The War in Space.
Yeah, War in Space. So yeah. So anyway, I'll keep on reading. I know Jimmy's gonna skewer me. So he said, I learned that the Gotengo was still housed on the island where Captain Jinguchi built it. I went there and met the good captain along with Makoto, Susumu, and their 3 kids. After refusing to get off Jinguchi's lawn, which is what he called the entire island, I asked him if I could examine the Gotengo's blueprints and take it for a flight. He said no, and punched me in the arm. It hurt more than it should have. So I did what any good U.S. Air Force NASA engineer would do. I snuck back onto the island in the dead of night and borrowed the Gotengo. To this day, it's one of my all-time favorite flights. Sadly, I didn't get it back by daybreak, and Jinguchi continued to channel his inner Eastwood. By that, I mean a gun may have been involved in our negotiations. I was forbidden from returning to his island. Fast forward a few decades, and I returned to that island to ask if I could add the Gotengo to my garage on Monster Island, and to my shock, old man Jinguchi is still alive. I don't know if he's dipping into Nick Fury's Infinity Formula, or if he's just too stubborn to die. But he once again forbade me to come anywhere near the Gotengo, and the same gun may have been involved. So there it remains for now. I mean, Jinguchi can't live forever, right? And I survived the infamous War in Space, so I should be able to outlive him, right? And he said, and remember, Michael, first we're gonna rock, then we're gonna roll. Sincerely, Jimmy from NASA, producer of the Monster Island Film Vault.
Oh boy. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Jimmy, for that. Oh boy. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, next week's trivia question is, what monster film was kept under wraps so well that the title was not even revealed until 4 to 5 months after the first trailer came out? So secretive that even the title of the movie wasn't revealed until 4 or 5 months after the trailer. So if you want to answer that question, or if you want to send us an email like Jimmy did and have it read out on the podcast, you can do that at kaijuweekly@gmail.com or on Twitter at Kaiju Weekly. And yeah, so that's the way to get in touch with us. Thank you to everyone for listening to this episode. If you want to follow the podcast on social media, I already mentioned the Twitter, I already mentioned the Gmail, but you can also follow us on Instagram at Kaiju Weekly Pod. You can send questions, comments, or answers to the trivia question to our email. You can also find us at the Kaiju Groupie Facebook group, where we will also be posting the question for this week that you can also comment on there. Also follow Michael at Kaiju Groupie Pod and the Kaiju Groupie on Twitter and Instagram. A big thank you to Brian, Shijier, and Thorax for supporting us on Patreon. You can also support the podcast and help us reach our goal of going to Blob Fest one day and getting to see the still semi-liquidy blob that still exists in that original bucket. You can support us and make our dreams come true by going to patreon.com/kaijuweeklypod.
I don't know, what kind of dreams are we having that our dream is to go see a bucket of goo?
That's my dream. Listen, I have a dream.
Oh, God.
That one day I will get to see the big bucket of goo.
Oh, boy.
The goo. I must see the goo.
Oh, boy.
This episode's going on for too long. Let's wrap it up.
Okay, so before we go, I just want to say, if you also want to support the podcast, there's one more way you can do so by leaving us a 5-star review on Apple podcast. We will accept nothing less than 5 stars. You can criticize us all you want in the comments, but it has to be 5 stars worth of comments. You can, if you do that, we promise we will read your feedback on a following episode, and it will also help put us in front of other kaiju and tokusatsu fans just like you.
Yep. And to close out this episode, I'm going to say, help control the giant blob population. Have your goo spayed or neutered.
How is that even possible?
I don't know.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.